I manage a small cafe near the Alexanderplatz U-Bahn station in Berlin. And last Tuesday, this American woman stood at the crosswalk outside my window for 11 straight minutes. The light was red, sure, but the street was completely empty. Not a single car, not even a bicycle. She just waited there, hands in pockets, staring at the little red man like he might suddenly explain the meaning of life. When I stepped outside to smoke, she turned to me and said, "Is this light broken? It's been red forever." I told her the light works fine. She can just cross. She looked at me like I had suggested robbing a bank. "But it's red," she said, pointing at it as if I might have missed this crucial detail. I shrugged and walked across the empty street to prove the point. She stayed put, and when I looked back from the other side, she was checking her phone, presumably Googling whether Germans have some secret pedestrian death wish. The light finally changed. She crossed with this relieved expression. And I went back to pulling espresso shots for customers who'd been jaywalking since they were 6. My cousin drives a taxi in Munich, and he picked up this American couple who spent the entire ride photographing every red light they passed. Not the buildings, not the Alps in the distance, just traffic signals. The guy explained they were documenting German traffic light culture for their blog about European infrastructure. When my cousin asked why they found traffic lights so fascinating, the woman said, "Back home, red lights are more like suggestions. Here, they're like sacred law. We've been here 3 days and haven't seen a single person jaywalk. Not one." My cousin didn't mention that he'd jaywalked twice that morning getting coffee. He just nodded and took them to their hotel, where they probably wrote a 1,000-word post about Teutonic discipline. I work at a bookshop in Hamburg, and this American guy asked me why Germans worship traffic lights. He'd been here a week and claimed he'd never witnessed anyone cross against a red, even on completely deserted streets at midnight. He wanted to know if there were hidden cameras, or if we were just naturally more obedient. I told him people cross on red all the time when no cars are coming. He shook his head and said, "I've been watching. You guys wait, always." Turns out he'd only been observing intersections during morning rush hour near schools, where yeah, people tend to wait because there are kids around and actual traffic. He'd somehow convinced himself this represented all Germans' behavior at all times. My brother worked security at a museum in Dresden, and he watched this American family have a full debate at a pedestrian crossing outside. The light was red, the street was empty, except for one parked delivery van. And the parents were arguing about whether they should cross or wait. The dad kept saying, "When in Rome," which made no sense because we're in Germany, but whatever. The mom insisted they had to wait because Germans take rules seriously, and they didn't want to be disrespectful. Their teenage daughter just stood there scrolling her phone, clearly dying inside. After about 3 minutes of this ethical dilemma, the light changed. They crossed, and the dad announced, "See? Good things come to those who wait," my brother said. The whole scene had this weird energy, like they thought the ghost of Kant was going to appear and judge them for jaywalking. They'd turned a simple street crossing into a moral referendum on cultural respect, which might be the most American approach to following rules I've ever heard, of making it about some grand principle instead of just reading the situation. I teach English at a language school in Cologne, and one of my American students arrived 15 minutes late to class because she had to wait for the lights. She'd walked from the train station. A 10-minute trip, but apparently stopped at every single red light, even when no traffic was present. When I asked why she didn't just cross the empty streets, she said, "I read online that Germans will literally yell at you for crossing on red. Like strangers will call you out in front of everyone." She'd seen a blog post about some woman who got scolded by an old lady for jaywalking near a playground. And now she believed the entire country operates like a neighborhood watch program for pedestrian violations. I pointed out that the blog story was probably specific to that situation. There were kids around. Someone was setting a bad example, but she wasn't hearing it. She'd internalized this idea that Germany is one giant compliant zone where everyone monitors everyone else's traffic behavior. The next week she showed up on time, and when I asked if she'd figured out the lights, she admitted she'd just started taking a taxi to avoid the stress of navigating crosswalks. My girlfriend works at a hotel in Frankfurt, and she had to explain crosswalk etiquette to this American guest who'd filed a complaint about aggressive locals. Apparently he'd been standing at a red light near the Hauptwache at 2 in the morning. Completely alone on the street, and some guy walking by just crossed against the signal. The American was scandalized. He told my girlfriend I thought Germans had standards. This guy just walked right through a red light like laws don't apply to him. My girlfriend asked if there were any cars. He said no, but that wasn't the point. The point was the principle of the thing. She tried explaining that people generally wait when there's traffic or kids around, but otherwise it's not really enforced outside of specific contexts. He cut her off. So what I'm reading online is propaganda? All those articles about German rule following are just lies? She suggested maybe he was taking internet stereotypes too literally. He left the conversation clearly betrayed by reality's refusal to match his research. Like he'd shown up expecting a nation of crossing guards, and instead found normal people making normal judgment calls. I run a small art gallery in Leipzig, and during an opening last month, this American woman refused to leave the building because it was raining and the crosswalk light was red. She'd been ready to go, coat on, bag over her shoulder, but then she looked outside and just froze. When I asked if something was wrong, she pointed at the red light across the street and said, "I'll wait for the green." I told her she could just cross. There were no cars. It's 50 feet. She'd be fine. She gave me this patient smile and said, "I'm trying to respect local customs. I know Germans are serious about traffic rules." Then she launched into this explanation about how she'd read that German efficiency stems from collective adherence to small rules, and jaywalking undermines social trust. She'd somehow turned crossing an empty street in the rain into a philosophical stance on civic responsibility. I just said okay and went back to talking with other guests. She stood by the door for another 6 minutes, getting progressively more annoyed that the light wasn't changing faster. Fully convinced she was honoring our culture by getting slowly soaked instead of just walking 20 steps to her car. My uncle manages a beer garden in Stuttgart, and he told me about this American couple who wouldn't sit down at an empty table because the pedestrian signal across the street was red, and they hadn't properly entered the garden yet. They were standing right at the entrance, technically inside the property line. But they'd spotted the crosswalk signal and decided they needed to wait for green before proceeding to a table. When my uncle approached to seat them, the guy explained, "We're not trying to cause problems. We know how Germans feel about crossing on red." My uncle had no idea what he was talking about. He pointed at the empty tables and said, "Just pick one, anywhere." The woman hesitated and said, "But we jaywalked to get here. We crossed against the light because we were following other people. Now we're worried we've already made a bad impression." They worked themselves into this anxiety spiral where, breaking a rule, they'd read about online regardless of context meant they were now marked as disrespectful foreigners. My uncle eventually convinced them to just sit down and order beer. They spent the whole evening hyper-aware of every tiny interaction, clearly worried that someone had witnessed their pedestrian violation and was silently judging their entire character. I work at a Vietnamese restaurant in Hanover, and last week, this American guy asked if we validated jaywalking. He'd crossed the street to get here. The light was red, but no cars were anywhere nearby. And now he seemed convinced this was somehow going to affect his meal. When I asked what he meant by validate, he said, "Is this going to be a problem? Should I mention it?" I genuinely didn't understand the question. He explained that he'd read Germans take traffic rules very seriously, and he wasn't sure if crossing on red would make us, the restaurant staff, think less of him as a customer. I told him we literally don't care, and we're not even German. We're Vietnamese. He looked relieved, but also confused, like his entire framework for understanding social rules here had just collapsed. He sat down, ordered pho, and then spent 10 minutes telling his dinner companion about how complex German culture is, because the rules seem strict but also maybe aren't. And how do you know when it's okay to bend them? His companion just wanted to eat soup. My sister works at a bakery in Nuremberg, and she had this American customer who apologized for breaking the social contract before ordering a pretzel. When my sister asked what she meant, the woman explained she'd crossed against a red light on her way to the bakery because she was running late. There were no cars and she'd checked both ways, but now she felt guilty about it. She said, "I know Germans value order, and I just want you to know I don't normally do that." My sister told her it's completely fine and asked what kind of pretzel she wanted. The woman wasn't done. "It's just that I'm trying to be respectful," And I read that Germans will correct strangers who jaywalk, especially if there are children present. There weren't any children, but I still feel like I violated a cultural norm. My sister, who jaywalks approximately 4 times a day, just nodded along and handed over the pretzel. The woman left still visibly bothered by her minor act of pedestrian rebellion, like she'd committed some irreversible faux pas that would follow her through the rest of her trip. I bartended at a cocktail place in Bremen, and this American guy tipped me extra because I'd been cool about the jaywalking thing. I had no memory of any jaywalking situation. He reminded me. He'd crossed the street to get here 30 minutes earlier, and the light was red. I'd been outside smoking and apparently witnessed this grave transgression. He said, "I figured you might refuse service or something, but you were cool about it." I explained that literally nobody cares if he crosses an empty street. He shook his head. "Nah, man, I've done my research. Germans are strict about this stuff. That's why your country runs so well. Everyone follows the rules." I pointed out that I'd jaywalked to work that morning. He laughed like I was joking to make him feel better. Then he launched into this theory about how German economic success is directly tied to pedestrian compliance, citing some article he'd read about social trust and minor rule following. I just poured his drink and accepted the extra tip, figuring if he wanted to believe traffic lights are the secret to our GDP, that's his business. I worked the ticket counter at Cologne Airport, and this American woman asked if there's a jaywalking grace period for tourists. She'd just arrived, hadn't even left the airport yet. But she'd looked up crosswalk culture before the trip and was preemptively anxious about it. She wanted to know how long she had before locals would expect her to follow the no crossing on red rule. Was it immediate, or did tourists get a day or two to adjust? I told her she could cross whenever it's safe. She pulled out her phone and showed me 3 different blog posts about German pedestrian law enforcement. One claimed you could be fined 50 euros for jaywalking. Another said locals would publicly shame you. A third featured a story about someone getting scolded by a grandmother. She'd synthesized all this into a belief that Germany operates under some kind of traffic light surveillance state. I explained the reality. People generally wait when there's traffic, especially near schools, but otherwise it's just common sense. She looked skeptical. Before walking away, she said, "I'll just wait for green every time. Better safe than sorry." I watched her head toward ground transportation, probably ready to spend her entire trip paralyzed at empty intersections. My roommate works for a bike tour company in Potsdam, and one of his American clients refused to let the group cross against a red light, even though they were on bicycles and the street was completely clear. The whole tour stopped because this one guy wouldn't budge. He said, "I'm not going to be that American who breaks local laws." My roommate explained that on bikes, people assess traffic and go when it's safe. There's some flexibility. The American wasn't having it. I saw a documentary about German infrastructure. "You guys engineered these cities around rule following. The traffic lights aren't suggestions?" The rest of the group was getting irritated because they were just sitting there at an empty intersection, while this guy delivered a speech about civic responsibility. Eventually, the light changed naturally, and they moved on. But he brought it up 3 more times during the tour, clearly proud of himself for respecting what he believed was a sacred German custom. My roommate said the guy had turned a bike tour into a TED Talk about pedestrian ethics, and nobody had the heart to tell him that literally everyone on the tour had jaywalked at some point that morning before meeting up. I drive a delivery van in Dusseldorf, and I had to wait behind this American tourist who was standing in the bike lane at a red light blocking the entire path. When I honked gently to let him know he was in the way, he turned around and gave me a thumbs up. It's like I was honking in solidarity with his decision to wait for green. I rolled down my window and told him he could just move to the sidewalk or cross the empty street. He shouted back, "I've got time. Rules are rules." Then he stood there, arms crossed, apparently making some kind of personal stand about traffic compliance. The light changed after another minute, and he crossed with this triumphant expression, probably feeling like he'd really integrated into German culture by following the letter of the law at the expense of basic situational awareness. I've delivered packages in this city for 8 years, and I've never seen someone so committed to waiting at a light that they'd willingly block a bike lane to do it. I work at a tourist information center in Rothenburg, and this American asked for a map of crosswalks that don't have cameras. He was convinced traffic lights here are monitored and violations are automatically ticketed. When I told him that's not how it works, he said, "Then how does everyone know to wait? There's got to be enforcement." I explained that people mostly just wait when there's actual traffic or when kids are around. But he rejected this explanation entirely. He decided before arriving that German efficiency must be maintained through strict surveillance and universal compliance. The idea that people make contextual decisions, that sometimes they wait and sometimes they cross based on the situation, didn't fit his model. He left with the map, probably still convinced he was navigating a network of hidden cameras designed to catch pedestrian criminals. His friend, who'd been standing quietly the whole time, just shrugged at me like, "What are you gonna do?" I work at a hostel in Freiburg, and last night this American checked in and immediately asked about our jaywalking policy. I told him we don't have one because we're a hostel, not a traffic court. He seemed disappointed. He explained he'd been in Germany for 2 weeks and hadn't jaywalked once, waiting at every red light regardless of traffic conditions. And he was hoping someone would finally acknowledge his restraint. I congratulated him, not sure what else to say. He nodded seriously and said, "When you respect the small rules, the big ones take care of themselves. That's what makes this country work." Then he headed to his room, presumably to write a blog post about his profound cultural observations based on 2 weeks of standing at empty intersections. Here's the thing about red lights in Germany. We wait when it makes sense. Traffic's coming? Wait. Kids around? Wait. Middle of the night? On an empty street? Most people cross. Americans show up expecting some rigid national obedience program and then get disappointed when reality's more boring. They want their stereotypes confirmed so badly they'll stand in the rain rather than admit they've overcomplicated a simple decision. Next time, just look both ways and use your judgment. The light's not going to call the police.